Florence Donnelly stepped off the stage at Dusty Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, with exactly 11 cents in her coat pocket, a carpet bag that held 2 dresses and a broken comb, and the particular kind of quiet determination that settles into a woman after the world has already done its worst to her. She had nothing. She knew it. She had counted the nothing on her fingers all the way from Cincinnati, watching the green rolling hills of Ohio flatten into something ancient and wide and indifferent, and she had decided, somewhere in the space between Indiana and the open prairie, that nothing was something she could work with. It had to be. It was all she had. The town of Dusty Creek was not much to look at. A single main street stitched together by a general store, a livery stable, a barber, a small church with a crooked steeple, a saloon called the Red Star, and a modest hotel called Caldwell's that had seen better years. The wooden boardwalks had gaps where planks had rotted through, and the wind pushed dust along the street in lazy spirals, as though even the dust could not quite commit to going anywhere. 2 old men sat in front of the general store on a bench, watching Florence the way men in small towns watch anything that does not belong there yet. She straightened her spine and walked toward Caldwell's hotel because that was the sensible place to begin. A roof first, she told herself, then food, then the rest of it. The woman behind the desk at Caldwell's was named Mrs. Harlow, a compact, steel-gray woman with kind eyes that she kept half-hidden behind a brisk manner, the way some people keep their best china behind glass. "A room," Florence said, "the least expensive you have." Mrs. Harlow looked at her the way experienced women look at other women who are arriving somewhere alone and carrying very little. It was not unkind. It was just honest. 30 cents a night, Mrs. Harlow said, includes breakfast. Florence set her 11 cents on the counter without flinching. "I can give you this tonight and I will have the rest by tomorrow evening. I'm a hard worker and I am looking for employment. If you know of anything, I would be grateful." Mrs. Harlow studied the 11 cents. Then she studied Florence. She pushed one of the cents back across the counter. "Keep a penny for yourself. You look like you could use it. And as it happens, I need someone to help with laundry and rooms. $2 a week plus your board. You willing?" Florence felt something loosen in her chest, something she had been holding tight for 3 weeks. "Very much willing," she said. That was how Florence Donnelly came to Dusty Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1879. Not with a plan, not with connections, not with money or beauty or anyone waiting for her at the other end of the journey. She came with 11 cents and the quiet conviction that the worst was already behind her. She was 24 years old. She had left a marriage she could not continue, a house that had become a kind of prison, and a city full of people who preferred to look away from other people's pain. She had left quietly in the early morning, with her carpet bag and the clothes on her back and no forwarding address. The West, she had decided, was big enough to disappear into, and, if she was very fortunate, big enough to find something new in as well. She did not yet know about Charles Whitfield. Nobody in Dusty Creek mentioned Charles Whitfield until her 3rd day in town, when she was hauling a basket of wet sheets out behind Caldwell's to hang them on the line in the warm May wind, and one of the stable boys came running past shouting that Whitfield's cattle were loose on the South Road again, and somebody had better warn the feed store. Florence watched him run and said to no one in particular, "Who is Whitfield, Mrs.?" Harlow, who had come out to help with the sheets, answered without looking up from her work. "Charles Whitfield, rancher, runs the sundown spread about 4 miles east of town. Good man, quiet, keeps mostly to himself since his wife passed 3 years back." Florence nodded and thought nothing more of it. She had not come west to think about men. She had come west to think about herself for the first time in a long time. She spent her first week learning the rhythms of the hotel. Mornings were laundry and rooms. Afternoons were whatever needed doing, which was usually a great deal. Evenings she sat in the small room behind the kitchen that Mrs. Harlow had given her, and she wrote in a small notebook she had bought for 3 cents at the general store, recording the day in careful handwriting, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was a girl. On the morning of her 8th day, she was sweeping the front steps of the hotel when the horse came down the street at a walk, and the man on its back was looking at something on the ground ahead of him with a concentration so focused he did not immediately notice her. The horse was a bay mare, solid and calm. The man was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a sun-faded canvas jacket and a hat that had been through considerable weather. He was not young and he was not old. He was somewhere in that middle ground of a man who has spent years working outdoors, which tends to age the skin while keeping the body lean and capable. Florence guessed he was in his early to mid-30s. He looked up. Their eyes met for the length of a breath. He touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am." "Good morning," Florence said, and went back to sweeping. He rode past and she did not watch him go. She was not the sort of woman who watched men ride past. Or at least, she was working very hard at becoming that sort of woman. It was the blacksmith, a jovial, red-faced man named Pete Dooley, who told her at dinner that evening that the rider had been Charles Whitfield. "Comes in every week or two for supplies," Pete said, pulling at his coffee. "Good man, honest, runs a clean operation, got about 2,000 head of cattle and a crew of 6 men, does things fair." He paused. "Lost his wife to a fever, has a daughter, little girl about 7 years old, name's Emmy, sweet child." Florence absorbed this information with the neutral expression she had been cultivating. "He looked like a man who thinks too much," she said. Pete laughed at that. "That is about the truest thing anyone has ever said about Charles Whitfield." She did not see Charles Whitfield again for another 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, she found her footing in Dusty Creek with the methodical persistence that had always been her strongest quality. She was good at work. She was good at early mornings and late evenings. She was good at making small talk with the guests without revealing anything about herself. And she was good at listening to the town's various characters as they passed through the hotel lobby, learning the geography of the place through its gossip and its grievances. She learned that the territory had its tensions. The Cheyenne and Arapaho people who had lived on this land for generations had been pushed onto reservations by treaty arrangements that most people in Dusty Creek referred to with either indifference or the casual brutality of those who benefit from an injustice they did not personally commit. Florence found this deeply uncomfortable, in the way that all honest people find an injustice uncomfortable when they cannot look away from it. There was nothing she could do about it. But she did not pretend it was not there. She learned that there was a man named Harlan Greer who owned several properties on the main street and who seemed to make most of his money through means that no one in town could quite pin down, but that everyone seemed vaguely uneasy about. She learned to stay clear of Harlan Greer. She learned that the spring rains were inconsistent and that a dry summer could devastate the ranchers and farmers for miles around. She learned that the nearest proper doctor was in Abilene, that the preacher at the crooked steepled church was a decent and learned man named Reverend Cole, and that on Saturday nights the Red Star Saloon got loud enough to rattle the walls of the hotel 2 buildings down. And on the 3rd week of June, she learned something about herself. She was carrying a tray of food out to a guest in room 4 when she passed through the small lobby and found Charles Whitfield standing at the desk, talking quietly with Mrs. Harlow. He had his hat in his hand, and his dark hair was pressed flat in a ring around his head from wearing it, the way every working man's hair looked at the end of a long day. There was a small girl beside him, pressed against his leg with both hands wrapped in the fabric of his jacket, watching the world from that safe position with large, dark eyes. Florence stopped before she fully realized she had stopped. The little girl looked at her. Then she smiled, a sudden, unhesitating thing, the smile of a child who does not yet know to be cautious about the world. Florence smiled back without thinking. Charles Whitfield turned at that moment, following his daughter's gaze, and found Florence standing in the lobby with a tray of food and a smile still on her face that had not yet had time to become something more composed. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of small, private thing that happens in a man's face when he is not expecting to be surprised and suddenly is. "Evening," he said. "Good evening," Florence replied and carried her tray to room 4. She did not think about it afterward. Or rather, she thought about it in the determined not thinking about it way that means you are thinking about it constantly. Mrs. Harlow mentioned at breakfast the next morning that Charles Whitfield had rented the small room at the end of the hall for himself and his daughter. They had driven in from the ranch the night before, and the little girl had a summer fever that he wanted the doctor in Abilene to look at, which meant 2 days in town waiting for the doctor to make his rounds through Dusty Creek. "He worries about that child something fierce," Mrs. Harlow said, with the kind of gentle affection that comes from knowing someone's grief. "She is all he has left of Margaret." Florence heard the name Margaret and understood without being told that it was the wife who had died of fever 3 years ago. She heard the story in those 2 syllables, the way you sometimes hear an entire history in the briefest mention. She did her work that day with extra care. She brought fresh water to room 6 without being asked. When she passed the room and heard the little girl coughing in the dry, rattling way of summer fevers, she stopped and knocked gently on the door. Charles Whitfield opened it. He had been sitting vigil for some hours, clearly. There were shadows under his eyes and his collar was open and he was holding a cloth that had been dipped in cool water. "I thought," Florence said, "if it would help, I know a preparation of willow bark tea that is good for fever. My mother was something of an herbalist. Mrs. Harlow has some dried bark in her kitchen." He looked at her with those dark, considering eyes. "I would be grateful," he said, and it sounded like he meant considerably more than the words. She made the tea. She brought it. She showed him how much to give and how often. She did not linger. She went back to her work. But he came to find her an hour later when Emmy had fallen into a calmer sleep, and he found her in the back hallway folding linens, and he leaned against the wall beside the linen shelf and said, "She is sleeping easier." "Good," Florence said. "The fever should break by morning if you keep the room cool and keep giving her the tea every few hours. You know a great deal about such things." "My mother taught me. She was a practical woman." He was quiet for a moment. She folded a sheet and did not look at him. "I do not believe I know your name," he said. "Florence Donnelly, Charles Whitfield." A pause. "Though I expect you already know that." She did not pretend otherwise. "This is a small town." The corner of his mouth lifted. It was not quite a smile. It was the suggestion of one which on a man who seemed unaccustomed to them was somehow more interesting. "I expect you know a great deal about me already then," he said, "and I know nothing about you." "That is the privilege of arriving somewhere new," Florence said. "You are just a story to me. I am not a story to anyone yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "Everyone is a story," he said quietly. "Even people who do not know it." She looked up from the sheet then, because that was not what she had expected him to say. He was watching her with a frank, unguarded attention that she was not prepared for, and she felt something stir in the very center of her chest like a match being struck in a dark room. "Good night, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Good night, Miss Donnelly." She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed slowly. She had not come west to feel this way. She had come west to be free of exactly this kind of disruption, this unsettling warmth that rolled through her without her permission. She reminded herself that she was here to build something, not to build it around someone else, around herself this time. She said that very firmly to herself 3 times before she fell asleep. The next morning, Emmy Whitfield's fever had broken. Florence heard the child's voice in the hallway, thin but bright, asking her father if they could have eggs for breakfast, and Florence heard Charles Whitfield's low voice answering yes, and something in the warmth of that small exchange made her close her eyes for a moment before she went about her work. She was carrying the breakfast tray to the dining room when Emmy came pelting down the hallway in her nightgown, hair wild and dark around her shoulders, and came to a stop directly in front of Florence with that same sudden fearless smile. "You made the tea that fixed me," the girl announced. "I provided the tea," Florence said carefully. "Your body did the fixing." Emmy considered this with the serious concentration of a 7-year-old. "I think it was the tea," she decided. "It tasted terrible. Papa said only the best medicine tastes that terrible." Florence laughed, genuinely and without warning, and it surprised her because it had been a long time since laughter felt involuntary. "Your father is a wise man." "He is," Emmy agreed, with the perfect confidence of a child who has never doubted her father. "Are you going to be here forever?" Florence set the tray down on the sideboard. "I do not know about forever," she said honestly. "I am here for now." Emmy seemed to find this satisfactory. She took Florence's hand without ceremony, the way small children take hands as though it is simply the most sensible arrangement, and led her toward the dining room, saying, "Come eat breakfast with us." Florence should have made an excuse. She should have said she had work to do, which was true. Instead, she let herself be led, because it had been a very long time since anyone had wanted her company that simply and unconditionally. Charles Whitfield was already at the breakfast table. He looked up when they came in, his daughter in her nightgown holding the hand of the woman he had spoken with the night before, and his expression did that same quiet shifting thing. "Papa," Emmy said, climbing into her chair, "she is going to have breakfast with us." "Is she?" Charles said in a tone that was not quite a question. Florence prepared to apologize and retreat, but he was already pulling out the chair across from him. "Please," he said. She sat. They ate breakfast in a configuration that felt both completely ordinary and oddly charged, the way mornings sometimes do when something important is quietly beginning. Emmy talked a great deal about the ranch, about a horse named Biscuit, about how she had been learning to braid rope from one of the ranch hands, about a story she was reading that Reverend Cole had lent her. Florence listened and asked questions, because asking questions was something she did well when she was nervous. Charles answered some of the questions Emmy missed and watched Florence with a steady attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things he found interesting. It was not intrusive. It was the attention of a man who had learned to observe the world carefully and who had perhaps not had much occasion lately to observe something that pleased him. When Emmy was distracted by the arrival of her scrambled eggs, Charles said quietly, "Where are you from, Miss Donnelly?" "Cincinnati," Florence said. "Long way to come." "Yes." He waited in the way of someone comfortable with silence and with not pushing. Florence looked at her coffee cup. "I needed a long way," she said finally. He nodded slowly, and she understood that he was the kind of man who knew when to ask no further. It was, she thought, a rare quality. "I came back here after my wife died," he said after a moment, not as a confidence exactly, more as a trade, a small offered piece of his own story so she would know she was not the only one carrying something. "I had been thinking of moving, going further west maybe, California, but Emmy needed familiar ground, and so did I think. Sometimes the place you are is the best place to begin again from." Florence looked up at him then. He was looking at his coffee. "Nothing is a fine place to begin," he said, quietly, almost to himself. Then he looked up and met her eyes, and something in his expression said he had not quite meant to say that out loud. Florence felt the words land in her chest like something dropped into still water. She felt the ripples move outward. "That is exactly what I have been telling myself," she said softly. They looked at each other across the breakfast table while Emmy ate her eggs, and the morning light came through the window at a long, golden angle, and it was the kind of moment that does not announce itself loudly, but that you remember for the rest of your life. Charles Whitfield took Emmy home to the ranch that afternoon. He paid his bill at the front desk and tipped his hat to Mrs. Harlow and turned once, at the door, to where Florence was standing near the lobby with a stack of fresh-pressed napkins. "Good day, Miss Donnelly," he said. "Good day, Mr. Whitfield," she replied. He left. The door swung closed. Florence stood in the lobby holding her napkins and told herself very sternly that she had come west for herself, not for a pair of dark eyes and a quietly delivered truth that had been rattling around her chest for the better part of the afternoon. She was moderately successful in this effort for about a week. He came back on a Tuesday, which she learned was his usual day for supplies, and he stopped in the lobby to speak with Mrs. Harlow about something, and when he left he said good morning to Florence on the steps and paused just a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she thought she caught, in the brief silence before he moved on, the shape of something he had almost said and decided against. She thought about it more than she should have. The summer deepened. The prairie turned the color of old gold under a relentless sky. Florence found her days filling up with purpose. She was good at the work of the hotel, genuinely good at it, and Mrs. Harlow was the kind of employer who gave real credit where it was due. By July, Florence had moved from laundering sheets to managing the books when Mrs. Harlow's eyes were giving her trouble, and she found she was good at that too. She had begun to make friends in the town in that gradual way that only happens in small places, where trust is built slowly and deliberately. Pete the blacksmith had become a sort of jovial fixture in her days. The young woman who ran the millinery shop, a dark-haired girl named Clara Martinez, had started inviting Florence to walk with her in the evenings after the heat broke. Reverend Cole had lent her 2 books from his library after discovering she had read everything she had brought with her and was working on her second read-through. She was building a life. It was small, and it was real, and it was hers. Charles Whitfield came in on Tuesdays and sometimes on other days for various reasons, and he always stopped to speak with her when she was in the lobby, and the conversations grew longer by increments so slow she barely noticed them growing. One Tuesday, it was 10 minutes about the weather. The following week, it was 20 minutes about a book she had borrowed from Reverend Cole that he had also read. The week after that, it was 40 minutes sitting on the front steps of the hotel in the long evening light while Emmy, who had come with him, chased fireflies in the dusty street. He told her about the ranch. Not boastfully, but the way a man talks about something he loves when he is comfortable enough to love it in front of someone. He talked about the particular quality of the light on the eastern fields in the morning, and how the cattle moved in the cold months, and how he had built a second barn 2 summers ago with his own hands and 3 of his crew, and how he was proud of it in the way that men are proud of things they have made well. She told him things too, not the hard things, not yet, but the small, true things. She told him about her mother's garden in Cincinnati and the way it had smelled in the rain. She told him that she had always been good with numbers and had always wanted to put that to use but had never been allowed to in her life until now. She told him that she liked the prairie, had not expected to, had thought she would feel lost in all that open space, but instead had found it felt like breathing deeply after years of taking small, careful breaths. He listened to her the way he did everything, with steady, focused attention. He did not interrupt. He did not redirect. He listened as though what she was saying was genuinely interesting to him, which was both flattering and slightly alarming, because Florence had spent years with someone for whom she had been a fixture rather than a person. "You are different than what I expected," he said once on an August evening, while Emmy dozed between them on the steps with her head against Florence's shoulder, which had happened so naturally that neither adult had remarked on it. "What did you expect?" Florence asked. He considered. "I am not sure. Mrs. Harlow said a young woman from back east had come to work for her. I think I expected something more fragile." Florence looked at the fireflies. "I think people confuse having been through something hard with being fragile," she said. "They are not the same thing." "No," he said, "they are not." A pause. "Margaret," he said carefully, and she understood he was going to say something he did not say easily. "Margaret was fragile, I think, though she did not want to be. She worried about everything. The ranch, the weather, the money, the future. I think the worrying wore her down. When the fever came, she did not have much fight left." His voice was low and even, but she could hear the grief underneath it, quiet and settled the way grief becomes after 3 years, not gone but incorporated. "I do not say that to criticize her. She was a good woman, I loved her. I just think she was not suited to this life, and I brought her to it anyway because I loved it and I thought she would learn to love it too." Florence was quiet for a long moment. "You feel responsible," she said. "Yes." That is a heavy thing to carry. It is. He looked at her sideways. You are easy to say true things to. She felt warmth spread through her at that, warm and complicated. I was not always, she said. I was very good for a long time at not saying true things and not hearing them. He waited. I was married, she said, and it was the first time she had said it plainly in Dusty Creek, in Cincinnati, for 4 years. He was not a bad man, but he was not a good husband. He was not interested in who I was, only in what I could do for him. She paused. He was not cruel, just absent in the way that some men are absent while still being completely present. I became very small in that house. She looked at her hands. I left when I realized that if I stayed, I would disappear entirely. Some women manage it. I could not. Charles Whitfield said nothing for a moment. Then, good. She looked at him. Good that you left, he said, simply and completely without ambiguity. You should not disappear. Emmy shifted in her sleep and murmured something, and they both looked down at her with the instinctive attention of adults around sleeping children, and the moment stretched out into the warm August night, and Florence thought, with a clarity that startled her, that she was dangerously close to falling in love with this man. She told herself all the familiar things, that she had only just begun to find herself, that she did not want to build herself into someone else's life again, that she was not ready, that it was too soon, that the last time she had followed feeling, it had led her into 4 years of becoming invisible. But Charles Whitfield was not asking her to become invisible. He was, if anything, the most interested in her that any person had been in as long as she could remember. She told herself to be careful all the same. In September, a man named Harlan Greer came to the hotel looking for a room, and Florence was at the desk. She gave him a room without knowing yet why. Mrs. Harlow's face went careful and still when she saw him sign the register. She found out that evening when Mrs. Harlow called her into the kitchen and told her quietly that Greer was trying to buy up land on the south side of the territory, using methods that were not always clean. He had tried to pressure 2 families into selling their properties, and there were rumors of worse things, unprovable things, things that tended to happen to people who refused him. He is not a man to be alone with, Mrs. Harlow said. Florence took careful note of this. Greer was in residence for 3 days. He was polite in the way of men who are accustomed to performing pleasantness for strategic purposes, smooth and deliberate, and Florence watched him from behind her brisk professional manner and recognized the type with a cold and certain instinct. She had met men like him in Cincinnati, the kind who decided what things were worth and what people were worth and what to do with either. On his second day, she overheard him in the dining room talking to a man she did not recognize about land on the Eastern Road. She caught the name Sundown and her stomach tightened. She found a way to mention it to Pete the blacksmith, who found a way to mention it to Reverend Cole, who was on speaking terms with everyone in the county, and by the time Tuesday came and Charles Whitfield drove his wagon into town, he was already aware that Greer was in the area. He came to find Florence before he went to the general store. She was in the side garden behind the hotel, cutting late-season herbs for Mrs. Harlow's kitchen, and he came around the corner of the building, and she looked up and saw from his expression that he already knew. "You heard about Greer," she said. "I did." He stopped a few feet away. "He has already sent a man out to Sundown, made an offer on the land." Florence straightened up, her hands full of dried lavender stems. "What did you say?" "I said no." His jaw was set in that way she had learned meant he was holding something firm inside himself. "I have said no twice." "He does not seem to hear it well." Florence looked at him steadily. "You should not be alone in this. You should speak to the county sheriff and document every interaction. Have witnesses if he sends anyone again." He looked at her. "That is practical advice. It is practical advice you should follow." Something in his expression changed, softened a degree. "You worry about the ranch." "I worry about you," she said, and heard the words in the air between them and felt her face go warm, because it was truer and more simply said than she had intended. He was very still for a moment. "Florence," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded like something that had been waiting. "Mr. Whitfield," she said carefully. "Charles," he said, "please." She looked at him for a long moment in the herb garden with the September sun slanting through the remaining green leaves, and she thought about all the careful things she had told herself, and then she thought about a man who had said nothing is a fine place to begin, as though he believed it down to his bones. "Charles," she said, and felt the shape of it, simple and right. He took a step forward. "I have been trying to think of how to say something to you," he said, with the deliberate carefulness of a man who is uncomfortable with sentimental declarations and is attempting one anyway. "And I cannot find the elegant version, so I will say the plain one." She waited. "I would like very much to court you," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at the lavender in her hands. "I am not the same woman I was in Cincinnati," she said. "I have been finding out who I am here. I am not finished finding out." "I know that," he said. "I would not ask you to stop. I would like to know the person you are becoming alongside the person you are now." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that same steady attention, open and honest and not demanding. It was, she thought, the exact right thing to say. Not because it was clever, but because it was true, and she had learned to tell the difference. "Then I am willing," she said. He exhaled slowly, and she saw that he had been holding his breath, and the humanity of that, the vulnerability in a capable, reserved man holding his breath waiting for an answer, undid the last cautious knot somewhere in her chest. He did not touch her. He simply nodded once as though settling something decided between them and said, "I will call on you Sunday if Mrs. Harlow permits it. We could ride out and see the ranch if you like. Emmy has been asking to show you Biscuit." Florence smiled. She could not help it. "I would like that very much." He touched his hat brim and left her in the herb garden, and she stood there for a long time after with the late sun on her face and something so new and warm in her chest that she was almost afraid to name it. She named it anyway. She was a woman who had learned to be honest with herself. Hope, she thought. I had almost forgotten what it felt like. Sunday came with a sky the color of new copper and a wind that carried the first real edge of autumn, and Charles arrived at Caldwell's with 2 horses, the bay mare and a steady-tempered gray he had borrowed from Pete's stable for Florence to ride. He helped her mount with a courteous steadiness that did not make a fuss of the helping. Emmy was already at the ranch, left with the cook, a solid woman named Rosa who had been at Sundown for 6 years and who ran the kitchen and a great deal else besides. They rode east on the main road and then turned off onto a narrower track that rose gently between rolling grass, and Florence looked out across the prairie and felt it do the thing it always did to her, that expansion, that sense of the world drawing back to show you how large it actually was. "It never stops surprising me," she said. He was riding beside her close enough to talk comfortably. "What doesn't?" "The size of it." She gestured at the horizon. "In Cincinnati you look at a street or a building. Here you look at everything." "Some people find it frightening," he said. "Some people are frightened by things that are bigger than they expected," she said. "I find it a comfort." He looked at her profile. "Why a comfort?" she considered. "Because if the world is this large, then any single mistake I have made is very small indeed by comparison." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "I am going to think about that for a while," she laughed. "It is not a particularly profound thought. The most useful ones never are." The Sundown Ranch was beautiful. Florence had not known quite what she expected, but it was not this. A solid, well-built house of pale timber set on a rise with a wide porch that faced west, with 2 large barns beyond it, and a series of well-maintained corrals where horses moved with the particular easy grace of well-cared-for animals. The land rolled away in every direction in autumn gold, and the cattle were a dark mass in the mid-distance, steady and constant as weather. Emmy came running from the house the moment she heard the horses. She went directly to Florence, bypassing her father entirely in the way of children who are certain of their father's love and want to distribute their enthusiasm where it might be most impactful. "You came," Emmy said, as though there had been some doubt. "I came," Florence confirmed. "Biscuit is in the second corral. He has been waiting." Charles made a sound that Florence suspected was him suppressing a smile. "Biscuit has been eating grass all morning and is not aware of the occasion," he said. "He is aware," Emmy insisted with great certainty, and took Florence's hand and led her toward the corral. Biscuit was a small dun pony, stout and gentle and philosophically indifferent to being introduced to Florence, who offered her hand for him to smell in the way her mother had taught her, and then stroked his nose, and said she was very pleased to meet him. Emmy watched this with the satisfaction of someone whose two favorite things have been successfully introduced. Rosa made lunch on the wide porch, chicken and corn and fresh bread, and they ate in the autumn sun, and it was one of those meals that feel like something from a different life, something better, something that you look back on years later as the point at which things changed. After lunch, Emmy went inside to read, firmly announced that she was giving them time to talk, which she delivered with the transparency of a 7-year-old who has been thinking about adult matters in a 7-year-old way. Charles watched her go with an expression of fond exasperation. "She has decided," he said, "that I need looking after." "Children often decide that about their parents," Florence said. "She is not wrong." He leaned back in his chair. "I have been not very good at it these past few years. Looking after myself, I do the work. The ranch is well, but the rest of it," he paused, "the rest of it I have been leaving alone." Florence looked at the western view from the porch, the way the light lay on the grass. "You were grieving," she said. "I was, and then I just got used to a smaller life, I think. Emmy, the work, the seasons, it did not seem to need anything else." He looked at her. "And then you came." She felt the words settle into her quietly. "I did not come here looking for this," she said honestly. "I want you to know that. I came here looking for myself." "I know," he said. "That is part of what makes it worth something." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "A woman who comes to you because she is choosing to," he said, "is different from a woman who comes to you because she has nowhere else to go. The second kind is sadder for both of you." Florence thought of Cincinnati, thought of why she had stayed as long as she had, because leaving had felt impossible until the moment it was the only option. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way people do who have found the particular ease of each other's company. The wind moved through the dry grass below the porch. A hawk turned slow circles in the high blue sky. "I should tell you something," Florence said. "About Cincinnati." He waited. "My husband," she said. "I left him. He is not dead, a beat. I do not know if that matters to you in terms of the way you think of things." He was quiet for a long moment. "He knows you left." "Yes, he did not follow. I did not think he would." She paused. "He is not a man who chases things. He is a man who waits for things to come back. They usually do. But you did not come back." "No." Another silence. "It matters that you are honest with me," he said. "The rest of it is between you and your own conscience, and it sounds to me as though you have made a fair peace with it." She let out a slow breath. "I have." He nodded. "Then I have no quarrel with it." She looked at him and felt something settle in her like the last stone dropping into a foundation. The last uncertainty, the last expecting to be judged, quietly resolved. "You are a remarkable man," she said. "I do not say that carelessly." He looked faintly uncomfortable with the compliment, the way men who are not accustomed to receiving them often do. "I am a very ordinary man," he said, "who has been very fortunate in his life and very unfortunate, and is trying to appreciate the first while surviving the second." "That is all any of us are doing," Florence said. He smiled then, a full, unguarded smile that she had not seen before, and it transformed his face completely, and Florence felt something in her go quiet and warm and sure. Autumn came fully in October. The days shortened, and the prairie went the color of everything that has given what it had and is resting now, and Florence and Charles spent Sundays together with a regularity that became known in Dusty Creek without anyone having to be told. Pete grinned at her over the forge on Monday mornings. Clara Martinez said she was very happy for Florence and meant it. Mrs. Harlow said nothing at all, which was Mrs. Harlow's way of saying everything. He brought Emmy most Sundays. Sometimes Emmy stayed at the ranch with Rosa, and it was just the two of them. riding out to the edge of the property where the land rolled down to a creek that still had water in it, or sitting on the porch in the long evenings with the lamp between them, reading in comfortable parallel or talking. They talked a great deal, about everything and nothing, about his years building the ranch, about the cattle business and the ways it was changing, the railroad pushing further west and what that would mean, about her years in Cincinnati, and the small lost ambitions she had carried quietly there, about Emmy, who was doing well in school and reading above her years, and who had informed Florence one Sunday with great seriousness that she thought Florence was the best person she had ever met, which had made Florence press her fingers briefly to her mouth to hold something in. About Margaret. Charles spoke of her more easily now, not because the grief was gone, but because he was no longer keeping it locked away as though speaking of it would make it expand to fill everything. He spoke of what had been good between them, and what had been hard, and how he carried both things forward with him. Florence listened and understood, because grief is not shameful and love is not diminished by acknowledging that nothing is perfect. About her own marriage. She spoke of it more easily now too, in pieces, the way you dismantle something large by taking off one piece at a time until you can see it clearly without being overwhelmed by it. "Were you happy?" he asked once. "At first," she said. "In the first year, I thought I knew what it would be. And then the year after was a little less, and the year after that a little less again, until I looked up one morning and I could not remember the last time I had laughed and meant it." She paused. "I think some unhappiness happens that slowly, so gradually that you do not notice it until you are standing in the middle of it and wondering how you arrived." "Yes," he said quietly. "I think that is true of a great many things." In November, Harlan Greer came back. He came to sundown this time, and Florence heard about it from Charles, who came to town on a Wednesday, which was not his usual day, and came straight to the hotel and asked to speak with her privately. They stood in the side garden, where the frost had killed the last of Mrs. Harlow's herbs, and Charles told her that Greer had come with a revised offer and two men she did not recognize who stood at the edge of his property line in a way that was meant to communicate something unpleasant. "He is trying to pressure me," Charles said, his jaw set. "He wants the eastern land. He says he needs it for a grazing contract. I do not believe him, but that is what he says." Florence thought about this carefully. "Did you go to the sheriff?" "Weeks ago." "The sheriff is sympathetic, but his hands are tied as long as Greer does nothing overtly illegal. Standing on the edge of someone's property is not illegal." His voice was controlled, but she heard the frustration beneath it. "He is a patient man, Greer. He builds pressure slowly. Then you need witnesses to every interaction and a written record of every offer and refusal, signed and dated," Florence said. "And you should speak to a lawyer in Abilene, not because you cannot manage this yourself, but because having legal documentation changes the calculation for a man like Greer. It makes you a harder target." He looked at her. "You think clearly when things are difficult." "I had a lot of practice staying calm in difficult situations," she said simply. "Not all of it was wasted." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had done so without the frame of helping her on or off a horse, just taking her hand because he wanted to, and she felt it all the way through her. "I'm not going to lose the ranch," he said. "I built it, I will keep it, but I wanted you to know because you matter to me in a way I am still finding words for, and I do not want to keep difficult things from you." She turned her hand in his and held it. "Tell me," she said. "Always, I am not fragile." "No," he said, and there was a world of admiration in the single syllable. "You are not." He went to Abilene the following week. He came back with documentation, and with a lawyer named Havorson who sent 2 formal letters, and Harlan Greer's attempts on the sundown land ceased. He moved on to other targets, which was an injustice of its own, but the ranch was safe. Sundown stood. Christmas in Dusty Creek was a quiet, honest affair. The church was full on Christmas Eve, and Reverend Cole gave a sermon that managed to be both learned and genuinely comforting, which is harder than it sounds. Florence sat with Mrs. Harlow and Clara Martinez and felt, for the first time in many years, that she was somewhere she belonged. Charles and Emmy came for the service. Emmy sat between Florence and her father with the easy assumption of a child who has decided where things ought to be and is simply waiting for the adults to catch up. After the service, in the cold blue dark outside the church with the stars brilliant overhead, Charles gave Florence a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a pair of warm gloves, good quality leather, and tucked inside the right glove was a small pressed wildflower that she recognized as the kind that grew along the creek at the edge of sundown, which meant he had pressed and saved it in the autumn and carried it all this time. She looked up at him and found him watching her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his version of open hope. "The gloves are practical," he said. "The flower is not. I included it anyway." "I am very glad you did," she said. He smiled. That full, unguarded smile. She rose on her toes and kissed him on the cheek quickly and warmly and felt him go still with the particular stillness of a man who is very pleased. Emmy looked up at both of them with the expression of someone whose predictions have been confirmed and found satisfactory. Winter deepened. Florence kept her work at the hotel, kept her room, kept her independence, and kept seeing Charles on Sundays and sometimes on other days when the week permitted. She was not in a hurry. She had learned something important about herself in these months in Dusty Creek, which was that she did not need to rush toward safety. She was not in danger. She was not desperate. She was choosing, and choosing felt entirely different from being chosen and accepting. Choosing felt like standing up straight. In January, when the cold had locked everything down and the prairie was a pale, still world of brown grass and gray sky, she told him, on a Sunday afternoon in the sundown house by the fire while Emmy napped, that she loved him. She said it plainly, the way she had come to say true things in this new life, without preamble or performance. "I love you," she said, looking at the fire. "I thought you should know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have loved you since the herb garden in September, and I have been trying to find the right moment to say it for 3 months." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with that steady, honest attention. "This was the right moment," she told him. "Yes," he agreed. "I believe you are right about most things." She laughed and he pulled her close and she put her head against his shoulder and they sat by the fire in the cold January light, and it was, Florence thought, the simplest and most complete happiness she had ever known. He proposed in February. He did not make it dramatic. It was not a moment staged for an audience. It was early on a Sunday morning, and she had ridden out to the ranch, and they were in the barn, because one of the mares was near to foaling, and Charles had been up since before dawn watching her. Florence had brought coffee from the hotel in a covered pot, and they stood together in the warm, hay-smelling quiet while the mare shifted peacefully in her stall, and Charles said, without turning from the horse, "I would like to marry you." Florence wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Would you?" she said. "I would." He turned to look at her. "I know that the legal situation is complicated given your previous arrangement. I do not care about that. I mean it in every way that matters. That I want to build a life with you. That you are the best thing that has happened to me and to Emmy in a very long time. That I would like you to have the thing I have at sundown, which is something I made and am proud of, not as something I am giving you, but as something I would share with you." Florence set her coffee down carefully on the top rail of the stall. "You know that I have been finding myself," she said. "I know. I have not stopped. I know that too. And you want to marry me anyway, not despite it, but as part of the arrangement." "Not as part of the arrangement," he said. "As the reason for it. I want to marry the woman who came west with nothing and made everything. That is who I am asking." She looked at him in the warm, early morning barn in the hay-sweet air, with the mare breathing quietly in her stall and the winter light coming in through the gap above the barn doors. And she thought of the girl who had stepped off a stage in this town with 11 cents and a broken comb, and the specific courage of someone who has decided to begin. She thought of everything she had built here. The work, the friends, the competence, the quiet daily joy of being a person she recognized and respected. She thought of Emmy's hand in hers. She thought of Sunday mornings and long conversations, and a pressed wildflower tucked inside a glove. She thought of a man who had said, quietly, almost to himself, that nothing is a fine place to begin. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, work-rough and warm, and kissed her, slowly and with everything in it. And Florence put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, and kissed him back. The mare shifted in her stall and made a sound of mild complaint at the interruption, and they both laughed against each other's mouths, and that too was perfect. They were married in April, in the second spring after Florence had arrived in Dusty Creek with her 11 cents, and her carpet bag and her quiet, iron-willed conviction. The ceremony was in the small church with the crooked steeple, and it was full of the people who had become her people. Mrs. Harlow in her best dress, Pete Dooley with his red face scrubbed to a shine, Clara Martinez weeping prettily, Reverend Cole presiding with great warmth, Rosa from the ranch cooking the wedding supper that happened afterward in the church yard in the April sun. Emmy Whitfield, who was 8 years old and who had been told she could walk with Florence down the aisle, and had taken this responsibility with the weight of someone being given a sacred trust, held Florence's hand so tightly the whole way that Florence's fingers went white, and Florence held on just as hard. Charles was waiting at the front of the church, in a good dark suit he had ordered from Abilene, and when she walked through the door and down the aisle, he looked at her the way she had come to understand he looked at everything he loved, steady, full, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world to take it in. She wore the dress Clara Martinez had helped her make, white cotton with small pearl buttons down the front, and a simple gathered skirt, nothing elaborate, nothing that was not herself. She had her mother's silver comb, repaired at the start of the summer by a patient watchmaker in Abilene who had said it was a fine old piece, in her hair. Reverend Cole spoke of new beginnings and the courage it takes to step into the unknown, and Florence thought that he had perhaps been listening more carefully in those months than she had known. She and Charles made their promises to each other in clear voices, looking at each other, and the promises were true because they said only what they meant. When Reverend Cole pronounced them married, Emmy Whitfield let out a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy that made the whole church laugh, and Charles turned to his daughter and picked her up and held her between them, both of them, and Florence wrapped her arm around the child's small back and felt the shape of what her life was now. The first year of their marriage was the best kind, full of work and laughter and the steady accumulation of shared life. Florence moved to Sundown in the spring, and the ranch became hers in the way that places become yours, slowly and by use, by knowing where everything was and where the shadows fell at different hours and which boards on the porch creaked. She kept the hotel's books for Mrs. Harlow, riding in on Tuesdays to do the numbers, which suited everyone and kept Florence connected to town life in a way she valued. She expanded the kitchen garden at Sundown, laying it out with the practical expertise of her mother's lessons. She planted herbs and vegetables in neat, productive rows. Rosa, who had initially regarded Florence with the cautious neutrality of a woman who has seen the household turn over before, became first an ally and then a genuine friend within a matter of weeks, largely because Florence respected competence wherever she found it and said so plainly. The ranch hands adjusted to her with varying degrees of swiftness. The oldest of them, a weathered man named Jim Taggart who had been at Sundown since Charles had first set it up, watched her for about a month before saying one morning over breakfast that she had more sense than most men he had worked for, which from Jim Taggart was approximately equivalent to a grand public declaration. In the second year of their marriage, Florence discovered she was expecting a child. She told Charles on a Sunday morning on the porch, in a repetition of the way she had come to tell him important things, plainly and directly, looking at him. She watched his face go through a rapid sequence of surprise, something luminous, and then the careful quieting of that luminousness into the measured concern of a man who had lost a wife to illness. "I am healthy," she said before he could speak. "I am strong, and I will see the doctor in Abilene at every stage, and I will not take any foolish chances. But I want you to be happy about this, Charles. I need you to be happy about this because I am." He exhaled slowly. Then the luminous thing came back and won the argument with the fear. "I am happy," he said, and his voice was rough with it. "I am terrified and I am happy." She took his hand. "Both of those things are allowed." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment. Emmy, when told, ascended to a pitch of delight that sent every dog in hearing range into a brief frenzy of sympathetic noise, and then immediately began producing an extremely detailed plan for what the baby's room should look like, which she presented to Florence on 3 closely written pages. Florence read every word of it carefully and implemented most of it, which Emmy considered deeply sensible. The pregnancy was uncomplicated. Florence worked through it with the same steady pragmatism she brought to everything, making adjustments where required, accepting help when offered, refusing to become either helpless or reckless. She saw the doctor in Abilene 4 times over the 9 months and was told on each occasion that she was in excellent health and was doing everything correctly. In the winter of their 2nd year, when the snow was on the ground and the fires were high, and Emmy was asleep in her room with a new library book from Reverend Cole, Florence and Charles were sitting by the fire in the main room of the sundown house when the moment that changes everything arrived. It arrived, as those moments do, with some urgency and in the middle of the night. Rosa was magnificent in a crisis, which Florence had suspected but not yet had occasion to confirm. Jim Taggart rode hard to Dusty Creek for the doctor and came back faster than seemed strictly possible. Charles was present the whole time, steady and determined, and occasionally required to be talked down from the kind of panic that overtakes even capable men in the particular vulnerability of that hour. Florence held on to her own certainty, the way she had always held on to things that mattered. Not tightly in the way of clutching at something, but steadily in the way of knowing what you are holding. Their son was born before the dawn, hollering magnificently. Charles, holding his son for the first time with the particular overwhelmed reverence of a man who is very carefully holding the most important thing, looked at Florence, and she had never in her life seen anyone look at her quite that way. "He is perfect," Charles said, in a voice she had never heard from him. "He has your ears," she said. "God help him," Charles said, and she laughed even though she was exhausted because he could make her laugh even now, even here. They named him William James Whitfield. William for no particular reason except that it sounded solid and capable. James for Charles's father, who had died when Charles was young, and who he spoke of with the particular fond grief of someone who lost their best teacher too soon. Emmy, who had slept through the entire dramatic event despite the general activity of the household, came downstairs in the early morning to find a brother. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at the small, red-faced creature in Florence's arms with an expression that moved through surprise, uncertainty, and then a capitulation so complete it was almost audible. "He is very small," she said. "He will get bigger," Florence said. "Can I hold him?" "When I have slept," Florence said. "I will wait," Emmy decided, and sat down in the chair by the bed with her book and proceeded to demonstrate the patience of someone who understands that the best things are worth waiting for. This, Florence thought, watching her stepdaughter read while her husband stood at the window with the early light on his face and her son slept in her arms. This is what I came west for. Not this exactly. I did not know about any of this when I stepped off that stage. But this is what was waiting, on the other side of nothing. Life at sundown expanded and deepened in the years that followed with the natural richness of things properly grown. William grew quickly, as small children do, and was in most things his father's son, quiet and observant and given to long silences followed by exact and considered statements. In the particular way of middle children who are also first sons, he occupied his own space with calm assurance. Emmy became, at 9 and 10 and 11, a girl of formidable competence and warmth, helping Florence in the garden and the kitchen, riding with her father to check the cattle, reading voraciously, and maintaining her conviction that she would one day be a doctor, which Florence encouraged without reservation, and which Charles supported with the uncomplicated love of a father who wants his daughter to have every door open. "Women cannot be doctors," someone said to Florence once, in town. "Not yet," Florence said pleasantly, and that was the end of that conversation. In the spring of what would have been their 5th year of marriage, on the anniversary of their wedding which they observed simply and privately every year, Charles took Florence out to the rise above the eastern fields at sunset, which was their place, the place they came when they wanted to be the simple version of themselves, and they sat in the long grass with the last light turning everything gold. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. He was 40 years old, lean and capable and marked by the life he had chosen, and she thought she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for whatever combination of chance and courage had brought them both to the same small town in the same particular year. "Tell me," she said. "When I said nothing is a fine place to begin," he said carefully, "I believed it. I had built this ranch from almost nothing. I thought I knew what it meant." He paused. "I did not know, then, what nothing really looks like on a person. The way a person can have stripped themselves back to their very center just to survive, and stand in that stripped-down place with their whole self still intact." He looked at her. "I did not know it until I watched you do it, and then I understood that the thing I had said was much more true than I had known when I said it." Florence looked at the horizon for a long moment. "I was terrified when I arrived here," she said. "I did not show it, but I was. I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that I had traded one prison for a different kind of wilderness." She paused. "And then Mrs. Harlow pushed a penny back across the counter and offered me work, and Emmy took my hand at breakfast, and I laughed at something for the first time in years, and a man told me that nothing was a fine place to begin, and I thought, yes, it is. Because I am still here, and that is everything." He took her hand the way he always took her hand, with the easy certainty of a man who has touched something precious often enough that he no longer has to be careful about it, just present with it. "I love you," he said, "today more than I knew how to yesterday." "I love you," she said, "and I am going to tell you something." He waited. "We are going to have another child," she said. He looked at her. The luminous thing came back immediately this time, faster and with less fear in it, because they had done this before, and they knew how it went, and there was room in him now for the joy without the terror crowding it quite so urgently. "When?" he asked. "November," she said. He pulled her close and held her in the long prairie light, and she put her arms around him and felt the solid, specific warmth of him, the smell of sun and horse and hard work, and the vast quiet of the Kansas evening all around them, and she thought that the world was very large and that in all of it she had found exactly the right place. Their second child was a girl, born in November as promised, small and determined from her very first breath. They named her Clara Margaret Whitfield, Clara for the young woman in the millinery shop who had walked with Florence in the evenings when Florence was new to the territory, and had needed the company of another woman's friendship, and Margaret for Charles's first wife, because Florence was not afraid of that name, and because Emmy cried with grateful surprise when she heard it, and because the woman who had loved Charles and Emmy before Florence deserved to be remembered in something living. Emmy was 11 when Clara was born, and took her role as elder sister with the gravitas of someone who had been preparing for this responsibility for 4 years. William, at 3, was largely indifferent to the baby except as an occasional source of interesting noise, and as a person who had taken what had previously been his exclusive position as small person in the household, which he managed with the equanimity of a child who had been raised in a warm and honest house, and who was secure enough to share. Clara grew into her name with the same determined energy she had shown at her arrival. She was a talker, voluble and opinionated and entirely certain of her place in the world, which made Charles smile the private, sideways smile Florence had come to know as the one reserved for things that made him unexpectedly happy. "She is entirely like you," he said once, watching 3-year-old Clara conduct a lengthy and one-sided negotiation with Biscuit the pony about whether she was allowed to ride without assistance yet. "I hope so," Florence said. "I mean it as the highest possible compliment," he said. "I know you do," she said, and reached up and touched his face briefly, the quick, warm intimacy of long and happy marriage, and he caught her hand and held it for a moment against his cheek. The years continued to accumulate at sundown with the quiet abundance of a good harvest. The ranch grew. Charles added a third barn and expanded the grazing land with 2 additional parcels, properly purchased through Havorson, the lawyer who had by now become something of a family institution. The cattle operation developed a reputation in the county for quality and fair dealing, which was the kind of reputation that Charles Whitfield cared most about. Florence, after the birth of Clara, had made a decision she had been turning over in her mind for a year or more. She spoke to Mrs. Harlow, and then to Reverend Cole, and then to Pete Dooley, who knew the practical reality of every business in the county, and then she told Charles one Sunday morning what she was thinking about. "A school," she said, "a proper one. Dusty Creek has 40 children between the ages of 5 and 14, and most of them receive less than 3 months of schooling a year because there is no dedicated building and no dedicated teacher. I would like to help establish one." He looked at her across the breakfast table. William was eating with the focused efficiency of a 4-year-old and paying no attention to the adults. Clara was on Florence's lap. "You have a specific plan," he said. It was not a question. He knew her well enough by now to hear the particular quality of certainty that meant she had already thought it through. "I have a very specific plan," she confirmed. "Tell me." She told him. She had spoken to 3 families already about contributing to the building cost. She had a piece of land in mind, donated by Reverend Cole on behalf of the church. She had identified a young woman from Abilene named Miss Ruth Haynes who had a teaching certificate and was looking for a position. She had worked out the cost of lumber and labor and the annual salary for the teacher. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She told him that too. The Dusty Creek schoolhouse was built in the summer of that year, a proper white-painted building with 4 windows and a good bell above the door. Miss Ruth Haynes arrived in September and was everything Florence had been told, capable and warm and serious about her work. 43 children enrolled in the first year, including William Whitfield, who turned 5 in October and took to schooling with the serious concentration he brought to everything. At the opening of the school, which was attended by essentially every person in the county who could get to Dusty Creek on a Thursday, Reverend Cole gave a speech, and then said that the school would not exist without the determination and generosity of one particular woman. And he named Florence Donnelly Whitfield, and the assembly applauded with a warmth that made Florence stand very straight and hold the feeling without deflecting it, which she was still learning to do. Charles, standing beside her, put his hand briefly at the small of her back, and she felt the pride in him, quiet and enormous. "You built something," he said quietly. "Again." "We built something," she said, which was also true, because you could not have one without the other. The person who imagined the thing and the person who believed in the imagining and made it possible. Emmy, at 14, attended the opening of the school and stood with the other young people of the county, and watched Florence and her father, and felt the particular fullness of a child who has grown up in a genuinely happy house and knows what that means. She would go on to become, in the fullness of time, the doctor she had announced she would become at the age of 7, trained in St. Louis in the late 1880s, one of a small and remarkable number of women who walked through the doors that had barely been cracked, the doors Florence had told her were going to open. But that was years later. On the day the school opened, Emmy was 14 and brilliant and convinced of the future in the unclouded way of people who have been loved well and given room. After the ceremony, Florence and Charles walked home to where Rosa had kept the children and had dinner waiting, and they walked through the late summer evening on the road between town and the ranch, the familiar 4-mile road that Florence had ridden or walked 100 times in the years since she had first come to Dusty Creek. "Tell me something," Charles said as they walked. "What would you like to know?" "That day you arrived," he said. "The very first day. What were you thinking when you stepped off the stage?" She thought about it honestly. "I was thinking that I had 11 cents and that I needed a roof, and that after the roof I would think about the rest. That is all." "That is all." I was trying to keep it very small and very immediate because if I thought about the whole of it I thought I might simply stop. He was quiet for a moment. "And now, if you could say something to that woman on the stage." Florence looked at the road ahead, the familiar path, the grass on either side, the first stars beginning in the east. "I would say," she said slowly, "that the nothing you are carrying is not an ending, that the world out here is bigger than anything you have been told. That there is a man who will look at you across a breakfast table and listen to you and believe in you, and a child who will take your hand before she knows your name, and a ranch and a garden and a school and a community that will become yours not because they were given to you but because you earned them by showing up and working and being exactly who you are." Charles was quiet for a long moment. "Is that what you would say?" he asked. "That," she said, "and to keep the 11 cents. They were the beginning of everything." He laughed, and it was the laugh she loved best, low and genuine and entirely his, and she reached over and took his hand and they walked home through the Kansas evening together under a sky that went on forever. The Sundown Ranch in the years that followed became a place of particular warmth, the kind of place that develops around people who love each other genuinely and who have enough room in their lives for others besides themselves. People came for Sunday meals that started in the afternoon and lasted until the stars were out, and Florence cooked, and Charles told stories, and the children grew, and the table was always full. William grew into a young man of quiet competence who took to the cattle business with the same steady seriousness his father brought to it, and who, at 16, had already begun to think about how the operation might expand into what he was reading about in the agricultural journals Florence ordered from back east. He was a reader, William, and a thinker, and his father watched him with pride that was partly recognition. Clara grew into exactly the person she had always insisted she was going to be. Loud, warm, absolutely certain, deeply affectionate, and constitutionally unable to resist any creature that needed help, which led to the back garden at sundown containing, at various times, 2 injured birds, a dog of uncertain parentage who stayed, and a coyote pup that did not stay but that Clara maintained had been deeply grateful upon its release. Florence's hair went gray at the temples first, as her mother's had, and she wore it as she wore everything, with the particular unself-conscious pride of a woman who has earned every year. Charles, watching her across the breakfast table one morning when the light caught the silver, said that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, in the same plain, unhurried way he had always said true things to her, and Florence believed him completely, because she knew by now that he was not the kind of man who said things he did not mean. She had come west with nothing. She knew that. She had counted the nothing, had turned it in her hands the whole long way across the country, had sat with it and decided that it was at least hers, completely and entirely hers, and that a person could begin from nothing if they were honest enough and stubborn enough and open enough to what the nothing might become. She had not known about Charles Whitfield. She had not known about Emmy's small, fearless hand in hers, or William's serious dark eyes, or Clara's uncontainable warmth. She had not known about Mrs. Harlow's pushed-back penny or Pete's red-faced grin, or Clara Martinez's friendship, or Reverend Cole's library, or the schoolhouse with the bell above the door. She had not known about any of it, but she had stepped off the stage with her 11 cents and her broken comb and her spine straight, and she had let the nothing be the beginning, and the beginning had become all of this. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Charles and Florence sat on the porch of the Sundown house in the long April dusk. The children were inside. Clara at 12 creating a complicated drama that involved several dolls and needed occasional adult consultation. William at 13 doing his schoolwork with the focused efficiency that made his teachers write letters home saying they had never taught such a student. Rosa had retired 2 years back to live with her sister in Abilene, and the kitchen was now Florence's own domain, assisted on big days by various members of the community who liked to cook and liked the company. The porch faced west, which meant they could watch the sky go through its evening colors, the sequence of golds and pinks and reds that turned the prairie into something from a painting every single night without asking for appreciation, just doing it because it was what the sky did. Charles had a glass of cider, Florence had her coffee, the dogs were at their feet. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. He looked out at the western light. I was thinking today, he said, about that day in the barn when I asked you to marry me. You were watching the mare, she said. You did not even look at me when you said it. I was nervous, he said, with the slight self-mocking dignity of a man admitting something that still slightly embarrasses him. You were nervous watching a horse. I was nervous asking the woman I loved to marry me while watching a horse, he clarified. There is a distinction. She smiled into her coffee. I know, she said. I found it endearing. I find that more embarrassing than the original incident, she laughed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the familiar, specific warmth of him, and they watched the sky go through its colors in the easy silence of people who have learned to inhabit quiet together without it meaning anything except that they are very comfortable with each other. Are you happy? He asked. He asked it sometimes, still, after 10 years, with a sincerity that had never become routine. Profoundly, she said each time, because it was true. She turned to look at him in the evening light, his face that she knew better than any face in the world, the lines around his eyes and the silver starting at his temples and the particular expression he wore right now, which was the expression of a man completely present in a moment he is grateful for. I am home, she said. That is what happy feels like to me. Not a feeling exactly, a place. You are home and this is home and I am here. He held her closer and she felt his cheek against her hair. You are home, he said quietly. You have been since you walked through the door of Caldwell's Hotel with 11 cents and the best spine I have ever seen on any person. She made a small sound of surprised laughter. You knew about the 11 cents. Mrs. Harlow told me, he admitted. Years later, she was very proud of you. Florence thought of Mrs. Harlow, who had retired now and was living comfortably with her sister in Topeka, and who received Florence's letters regularly and wrote back in the crisp, warm way of a woman who will not soften herself but who loves you without reservation. She gave me a roof, Florence said, when I had nothing. That is not a small thing. No, he agreed, it is not. Inside the house, Clara's drama reached some kind of crisis point that required resolution, and her voice rose with the passionate conviction of a 12-year-old in the middle of a story, and William's calmer voice could be heard providing a moderating influence, and the dogs lifted their heads and then settled back down at the familiar shape of the evening. Florence and Charles sat together on the porch of the house they had built together, in the middle of the life they had built together, on the land that was theirs, and the ranch that stood sound and the school in the town, 4 miles west where tomorrow's children were learning to read and think and reach for what they wanted. The stars were coming out in the east, the first bright ones in the darkening sky, and the air was cool with the particular April clarity of the Kansas evening, and everything Florence Donnelly Whitfield had ever needed was right here within the reach of her hand. She had come west with nothing, and nothing, as it had turned out, had been exactly and entirely the right place to begin.